Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, a comparatively young library that sits on one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I am on Gadigal land, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here with us this morning. And we are back for another year of Scholar Talks here at the State Library of New South Wales. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks, and I'm the coordinator of scholarship here at the library. There's lots of familiar names in the list of participants today, so welcome back to you, and of course a special welcome to those people who are here with us for the first time. So the Scholar Talk series is the first Tuesday of the month at 11 o'clock. We always have a speaker who's either been a fellow or a visiting scholar, or as in today's case, somebody who has used our collections extensively to produce a really important piece of work that documents the history of New South Wales. If you have any questions for our speaker, please use the chat feature in Zoom. And our speaker is today, of course, Dr. Meg Foster. Meg Foster is an award-winning historian of banditry, which I think would look fabulous on a business card. She also researches settler, colonial and public history. She is a contributor to this new book, History of Crime in Australia, edited by Nancy Cushing of the University of Newcastle. And today she will be focusing on the research that she did for her first book, Boundary Crosses, the hidden history of Australia's other bushrangers. So to talk about these other bushrangers and to teach us something new about bushranging when a lot of us think that we might know all there is to know, here is Meg Foster. Please make her welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I hope my slides are hopefully clear now. I would also like to start with acknowledging the Aboriginal people on whose lands I conducted my research. Although I'm currently in the UK, I conducted my research in Australia on the unceded lands of many Aboriginal groups, but in particular, I'd like to recognise the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I was lucky to live and work while doing this research. I'd like to recognise their elders, past and present, and also that Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded. I also need to begin this talk with a word on its content. As will already be clear, my work looks at people who were erased from our national story due to their race and gender. Essentially, bushrangers who were scrubbed from national consciousness because they weren't white men. First Nations members of the audience should know that this presentation contains names, words and images of Aboriginal people who have died. At its foundation, this presentation is about colonialism and its enduring legacies, and so there are some parts of this talk that readers might find, or listeners, in this case, audience members might find distressing. See if I can. Here we go. Okay, so in May 1855, all was not well on the Victorian diggings at Alma. Hundreds of miners rushed upon a group of men who the miners believed to be a gang of bushrangers, murderers, and thieves. Although crime was endemic on the goldfields of Victoria, where policing was minimal to non-existent, and huge transient populations coursed through the colony in search of new diggings, this gang was as unique as it was notorious. Although a majority of Goldfields criminals were white, this gang was headed by a 5-foot, 8-inch black man known as Black Douglas. Rumours had spread that Douglas had recently murdered a white woman at the diggings at Avoca. And so these white miners cast themselves as righteous avengers when they wielded picks and shovels as weapons to apprehend the well-known crew. But many miners didn't want to stop there. There were moves to lynch the men, and it seems likely the gang would have been killed had it not been for the valiant efforts of a very persuasive lone policeman. Black Douglas and his gang were carted to the police station in Maryborough instead. Now, although this vignette is brief, it clearly illustrates the contention of my research, that bushrangers were not all white men. Black Douglas, an African-American man, as well as the Chinese man named Sam Poo, and First Nations bushrangers, Mary Bug and Jimmy Governor, are four such people whose lives I follow in my book, Boundary Crossers, The Hidden History of Australia's Other Bushrangers. These people of colour were not just associated with bushranging in their own times. As Douglas's case shows us, some were downright notorious. Tales of Douglas's horrid misdeeds were passed around campfires and greeted new chums as they left their sea legs behind, while in the late 18 and early 1900s, it became a mark of distinction to say that you'd encountered Black Douglas on the Victorian goldfields. Worimi Aboriginal woman, Mary Bug, was the partner of one of the most famous white bushranging men in 1860s New South Wales, Frederick Ward, alias Captain Thunderbolt. But the authorities also believe that she accompanied him in his plunder. Sam Poo, a man born in the Fujian province of China, was referred to in seminal debates about the 1860s bushranging crisis. Aboriginal man, Jimmy Governor, is renowned for murdering the family of his white employer in 1900 and is remembered as an Aboriginal mass murderer, but he didn't see himself that way. Jimmy Governor actually called himself a bushranger. Douglas, Poo, Bug and Governor were notorious in their own times, yet they never made it into the national bushranging mythos. This talk will explain why. So, despite the lapse of over 100 years, bushrangers are still a part of our lives, albeit symbolically. They saturate popular culture, from video games to podcasts, films, and folklore. They punctuate Australia's tourist trails. The paraphernalia fills the shelves of big city souvenir shops and local country stores. They're an almost inescapable part of the physical landscape too. Travelling along the east coast of New South Wales, you might pass Bushrangers Hill, Bushrangers Reserve, Bushrangers Cave, Bushrangers Bay, Bushrangers Transport Proprietary Limited, Kellyville Bushrangers Junior League Football Club, Bushrangers 4x4 Gear, or Bushrangers Mowing. Moving further inland, you could find yourself travelling down roads, skirting alongside creeks, or sipping a cold one at pubs featuring these bushrangers' names. Ned Kellys are dotted throughout the landscape. They travel on car bumper stickers, wait patiently at the front of properties collecting mail, stand erect in yards or small town museums miles away from where Ned and his men ever trod their dusty boots. Bushrangers mark the bodies of ordinary Australians who tattoo themselves with bushrangers' names, faces, and words. Dozens of bushrangers with blazing guns swarmed the opening ceremony of the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games, representing our nation to the world. Millions of Australians love these brave white men, and we think that we know them. But the sense of familiarity can sometimes be our undoing. It makes us feel comfortable and stops us from pushing deeper and looking critically at the origins of these stories. White bushranging men were not born heroes. they were actively made a part of our national legend at people of colour's expense. I think it will be helpful to begin this talk at the very beginning, with the origins of Australian bushranging, before moving on to the creation of the Australian bushranging legend that we know and celebrate today. This will not only allow us to look critically at a tradition we feel we know, but understand Douglas, Who, Bug and Governor's erasure from our national legend, and the ongoing impact this has on stories about them. So, bushranger is a uniquely Australian word, and that's been brought into stark relief being here in the UK, where not many people have heard of the word and think I'm referring to a park ranger. So this is something that is very distinct to Australia. The first written reference to a bushranger was in 1801, although the practice of bushranging was almost as old as the colony of New South Wales itself. At its most basic, a bushranger was a criminal who survived by robbery with, or with at least the threat of violence. These figures were able to evade capture by living and concealing themselves in the Australian bush. Now, despite this somewhat solid definition of bushranging, it's important to remember that the meaning of bushranging was never static. Bushranging shifted and changed over time. The earliest bushrangers were largely convicts who escaped to live in the Australian bush. Most sought freedom from the confines of the colonial state. A select few made grand claims to be righting wrongs, to have adhered to a chivalric code, or cast themselves as colonial Robin Hoods. But most by far were opportunistic criminals who saw a chance to change their circumstance and fortune and took it, even if this meant robbing the poor. The 1860s was bushranging's golden age, and a time when the crime was endemic. The numbers are actually pretty astounding, and an estimate of more than 300 bushranging cases in this decade only represents the number of people who were convicted for bushranging crime. There are many more who never made their way to court or where there was insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. But more than this, the form of bushranging had changed by the middle of the century. The main bushranging threat didn't come from ex-convicts or immigrants, but so-called native New South Welshmen, who were white colonists born in the colony. These were meant to represent the colony's coming man, the new colonial type upon whose shoulders the colony's future rested. Now, while some looked upon these white men as a robust and admirable breed, the fact that they composed almost 70% of bushranging offences between 1862 and 67 seemed to somewhat undercut this more favourable view. The bushranging golden age not only saw a shift in the background of criminals, but a shift in their grievances, their public image, and in many instances, their self-styling. These men appealed to lower working class, colonial-born white colonists who felt disenfranchised, exploited, and forgotten by the well-to-do classes of society, especially the well-heeled British immigrants who disdained them. There were also those like Captain Thunderbolt, the partner of Aboriginal bushranger Mary Bug, who drew on older traditions of gallant highway robbery to soften their crimes and lend an air of respectability to their endeavours. Bushranging is meant to have ended with Ned Kelly on the scaffold in 1880. But the bushranging legend that we know today began to develop around Federation in 1901. So the national bushranging legend is actually a 20th century phenomenon, and that's pretty important. Right? Don't get me wrong, earlier generations of bushrangers had supporters. This was of supreme concern to government and respectable members of colonial society alike, and these supporters were often attributed with bushrangers' endurance and success throughout the colonial period. But we need to be careful and critical when it comes to examining the extent of this support and what it actually looked like. Although some bushrangers were living legends in their own times and had genuine support from the local population, there were actually many factors at play. Imagine that you're a colonist living in an isolated area. The nearest property to yours is miles away, and the police are probably even further. Suddenly, you, your workers, and your family are visited by bushrangers. It would be a lot easier for you to give the thieves provisions and information and send them on their way than to make a stand, especially when you don't know whether your workers would join you or join the bushrangers. Many people, even of the working classes and lower orders, thought they had a better shot giving bushrangers what they asked for, or even negotiating with them, rather than waiting for Her Majesty's finest. Historian Doug Morrissey has even shown that there's evidence the infamous Kellys were more feared than loved in rural Victoria, as they terrorised the local community as cattle duffers before they went on the run from the law. Support for bushranging was far from unanimous or always willingly given. The truth is already far messier than the legends would have us believe. So, although the Australian national bushranging legend has its roots in real bushrangers' lives and daring do's, it was far from beholden to them. In fact, our national bushranging legend relied on some very strategic forgetting. By 1901, bushrangers' display of physical prowess and manly strength increasingly became a symbol for the new nation's future. The real bushranging crisis had ended decades earlier in 1880, and by federation, the danger these figures had posed to colonial society was increasingly forgotten. In the vacuum left by this selective memory, white bushranging men came to represent Australians' egalitarianism, anti-authoritarianism, and pioneering spirit. Ironically, bushrangers who in their own times were considered threats to the colonial project became romantic exemplars of it. Their success in the bush apparently epitomised colonists' capacity to be at home in the natural environment and use the bush for their own ends. In this way, bushrangers helped to naturalise a white settler presence on the lands they colonised. It provided a useful story of white men at home in the bush that obscured and overshadowed the sovereignty of Australia's First Peoples. Although bushrangers were originally treated as bandits who lived beyond the bounds of civilised society, white bushranging men progressively became heroic ancestors who colonial Australians could be proud of. White male bushrangers created a usable past for the new Australian nation that sought both national distinction and to be part of a broader, masculine, white world. Settler Australians knew that their national tradition had been created transnationally, but they imagined points of connection with white British highwaymen and American cowboys, rather than Aboriginal resistance fighters, Fujianese bandits, or emancipated African Americans. Considering this connection between bushranging history and a usable white male past, it's easy to see why other bushrangers have not featured heavily in Australian history. Other bushrangers challenge rather than support the white masculinist framework that has bolstered Australian nationalism for decades. They're a reminder that diversity and difference are essential parts of Australian history. The fear and disruption that other bushrangers caused colonial society provides us with a unique opportunity to re-examine and critique common understandings of our nation's past. But it was precisely this radical potential that led earlier generations of historians to exclude other bushrangers or place them on the periphery of the national story. Issues of colonialism, and white settlers' beliefs about racial and gender difference still shape our national story. Now, there are probably some of you in the audience thinking, when are we getting to the good stuff? When are we going back to the stories, the high-speed chases, the daring robberies? When are we getting back to the lives of these new bushrangers? If this is you, I apologise, but unpacking these colonial legacies is essential if we're to have any hope of uncovering other bushrangers' stories on their own terms. We can't simply fit other bushrangers into the national legend. We can't just add a bit of colour to a tradition that we know so well. Absence not only characterises these bushrangers' place in our national consciousness, but their place in the archive, in the sources that remain for us to reconstruct their lives. My book isn't a comprehensive account of all other bushrangers who existed in Australian history. It uncovers the lives of 4 individuals, not only because they were exceptional, but because they left exceptional traces. Fragments of sources that together were large enough for me to chart something of their lives. But their archives are still grossly incomplete. While I would love to begin with Douglas, Pooh, Bug, and Governor's escapades and then present perfectly rendered accounts of their lives from birth to death, that's impossible. The evidence is just not there. Other bushrangers' stories will never be as seamless or complete as the bushranging tales we're used to encountering. The violence of colonisation was not just wrought on the bodies of people of colour, and its inequities were not just faced by women or minorities at the time. It manifests in the material that colonists kept about them, and it hampers our ability to access other bushrangers' lives or see the world through their eyes. But thankfully, this doesn't mean that it's impossible to access other bushrangers' story, or worse, that we shouldn't even try. It requires what historian Grace Karskens calls slow history. History that scrutinises every detail. History that forensically rereads conventional material, recognises archival silences, and pieces together disparate evidence to fill them. This all probably sounds very abstract, so for the remainder of my paper, I'll be anchoring this discussion in the life of Black Douglas. So I not only show you my process, i.e. how I went about writing this history, how alike it is to detective work and why it took basically 10 years to write, but also to show you how this talk could never just be about some new flashy bushrangers to add to our pantheon of national legends. Okay, so let's go back to where we left Douglas in May 1855. Douglas and his gang were on the goldfields at Alma in Victoria. They were surrounded by hundreds of diggers, wielding their tools as weapons to apprehend the men, and there were moves to lynch Douglas and his gang. I began this talk here not just because it's an extreme, perilous, and shocking story, but because this is where Douglas becomes a person of note to colonists. The first entry point we often have to other bushranger stories is when they first encountered crime. This is where they left the largest archival trace and where they sometimes quite literally leap onto the historical stage. Of course, Douglas hadn't just appeared out of thin air. Although he was infamous by 1855, he was already making a name for himself as a criminal in 1852, in the early years of the Victorian gold rush. At a public meeting in Melbourne in April that year, a military officer reported that, and this is a quote, "The notorious ruffian Black Douglas was seen carrying on his shoulders the dead body of a man who doubtless is one of his victims, and which body he was endeavouring to conceal or bury. But such was the terror of his name that no one dared to ascertain the fact." The passing of time did nothing to diminish Douglas's ill repute. Referring to Douglas and his criminal brothers in 1855, The Geelong Advertiser reported that, quote, "The whole neighbourhood of Simpsons, from Carisbrook to Avoca and New Bendigo, has for several weeks past been kept in a continual state of terror and apprehension by the depredations of gangs of scoundrels whose maraudings gradually increased in violence and brutality." A nervous digger requesting government protection assumed it was Douglas who took a dish of his tailings. A man on trial for sly grog selling declared that he committed the crime because he, quote, "lived in a continual state of excitement, fearing his life to be in danger from Black Douglas." And of course, the crime that ensured Douglas's downfall at the hands of miners in 1855 and that left the most enduring legacy was the murder of a white woman at Avoca in the Central Highlands of Victoria. Newspaper articles from Mount Alexander to Geelong, Maitland to Hobart, connected this crime with the diggers' uprising in no uncertain terms. According to the Mount Alexander Mail, quote, "The crowning act of the barbarities committed by these ruffians was the murder of a woman at Avoca, as reported elsewhere, and the diggers became sensible that they must themselves take measures for securing their own lives and property." When miners heard tales of murder or unfortunate travellers robbed of their possessions, stripped of their clothes, tied to trees and attacked by ferocious ants, they were warned to be watchful, aware, and ready to defend themselves and their property. Through repeated telling, these stories ensured that Black Douglas was as familiar in miners' ears as household words. Now, this all seems to provide a pretty neat and compelling tale of Douglas as a prolific, dastardly gold rush figure and serious criminal. Stories about him could be used to show the extent of lawlessness and crime on the diggings, to question the effectiveness of the police, to compare Victoria to the state of law and order on the American goldfields in California a few years earlier, and the list goes on. But this interpretation relies on us taking colonists at their word. It relies on us believing their fears and their anxieties about Douglas were based on something real. But we can't just assume, especially when these stories of Douglas as a gruesome bushranger and career criminal very helpfully supported white male colonists' ideas about race. It's a narrative that plays into settlers' idea that Black was associated with evil and villainy and cemented people of colour's position on the lowest rungs of the racial ladder. It's far too convenient a story to take at face value. We need to test the evidence. The evidence that's the easiest to test focuses on the crime that made the biggest splash, the murder of a white woman at Avoca. Instead of rumour and secondhand reports, I wanted to look at direct evidence of this very specific crime. And so, I went back through police registers and government gazettes, newspaper articles and official correspondence looking for this case. There were only 2 murders of white women on the diggings between March and May 1855. The first was committed over 30 kilometres away from the Avoca district where Douglas was supposed to have committed this crime. The second murder occurred on the 29th of April on the road between Avoca and New Bendigo. 5 mounted men committed a series of crimes in that vicinity. Among the outrages, they attacked and robbed a party of 4 men and 1 woman near Hawkins Hotel, shooting at and wounding the woman, of which wound she died the following day. This murder appears to match the one ascribed to Douglas, but for one crucial flaw. All 5 men were meticulously described in the Government Gazette's notice on the murder, and none of the offenders were Black. When the Gazette took the time to describe one criminal as a, quote, short, stout, full-faced man with light hair, aged about 22, wearing a light black coat and a Jim Crow hat, riding on a brown pony with a tan muzzle, it appears a glaring absence that it did not describe a Black offender's race, unless a Black man wasn't among the perpetrators of this crime. outside of Goldfield's gossip, there is no evidence that Douglas murdered a woman at Avoca. As soon as we cast a critical eye over stories about Douglas's serious crimes, they unravel. Black Douglas was never convicted for any heinous crimes. He was never convicted for theft or highway robbery, and certainly not for murder. The spectacular scene of hundreds of miners joining forces to end Douglas's reign of terror is undercut by the fact he faced court accused only of unlawfully entering the tent of 2 Maori and was sentenced under the Vagrant Act to 2 years hard labour. The Mount Alexander Mail and Geelong Advertiser newspaper reporters were shocked that, quote, notwithstanding the reputation which this chief of the robbers has obtained, it seems difficult to establish any serious charge against him, and he will have to be proceeded against as a consorter with thieves and vagabonds. Douglas was released early in February 1857 for good conduct, but within 2 months he was spotted among rowdy crowds on the grog tents at the Goulburn diggings, and in another he was at Beechworth jail for drunk and disorderly conduct. Only days after his release, he was before the bench again, fined 5 shillings for a similar offence, and ordered to leave the district. According to his criminal record, the redoubtable Douglas was a vagrant and a drunkard, as opposed to a murderous, violent thief. So, we've tested the evidence and found it wanting. The next step is to uncover why these stories gained such weight and had such an enduring legacy when they had such little basis in fact. This means painting a rich picture of the social landscape of the diggings, and particularly the role of race, gender, and crime in this tumultuous and shifting space. But that still can't be where the story ends. It's important to expose colonial falsehoods and use them to shine a new and critical light onto early colonial history. But if we focus solely on this angle, then Douglas quickly fades from view. He's confined to being a symbol, a vector for a larger argument, a nightmare of settlers' own creation, but never his own person. This reinforces the power dynamic set up by white colonists who didn't care about Douglas's story, who didn't want to know anything more about him than his supposed criminal propensities and the colour of his skin. Douglas would remain dehumanized and his story hollow, his personhood still stripped from records about him if we kept the colonial story without trying to recover how Douglas would have seen his own life. While white bushrangers' place in our histories is also largely the result of their criminality, other information about their lives remains. Whether to push for social reform to prevent more offenders, or to defend a bushranger's character or actions, white bushrangers were cast as individuals. It was not only their actions that were significant, but their life stories. The same was not true for other bushrangers like Douglas. Colonists didn't feel the same curiosity towards people of colour, in part because people of colour weren't seen as rational, intelligent, or capable of making informed choices about their lives, let alone pushing back against legitimate grievances. This is where history can do reparative work, where it can not only highlight colonial falsehoods and unequal power relations, but begin to fill the absences it's uncovered. So, who was Black Douglas? Answering this question required scouring every available source about him and pursuing every possible lead. I found Douglas's aliases, charted his later life, examined diggers' reminiscences that mentioned him, and in one newspaper article, I found reference that Douglas was an ex-convict. So, I trawled through convict records, comparing descriptions of convict men of about Douglas's age to later descriptions of him in criminal registers in Victoria. And eventually, miraculously, I found a match. Black Douglas was in fact William Douglas, an African-American man from Philadelphia who was tried at the Rye Quarter Sessions in this building in Sussex, England, for larceny in 1835. There, he'd been found guilty of stealing 2 woolen coats in the dead of winter, I might add, and was sentenced to transportation to New South Wales for this crime. Life in the colonies was not to Douglas's liking. In his 6 years in New South Wales, Douglas received 336 lashes and spent 12 months working in irons for various misdemeanours and crimes, from being absent without leave and neglect of work to assault. By 1841, it seems that Douglas was so unsatisfied with convict life that he tried to leave it. In 1841, he bolted into the bush to become a bushranger. Now, despite gold rush rumours to the contrary, this was the one and only time in Douglas's long life that he committed bushranging crime, and it was incredibly anticlimactic. Douglas and an accomplice named John Wood held up a cart at 7 Mile Hollow, robbed it of goods and provisions, and were captured soon after fleeing the crime. In this instance, for this crime, Douglas was tried and sentenced to be transported again, this time to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, now present-day Tasmania. Van Diemen's Land was a place of secondary punishment, a site to send criminals who had committed new crimes in the colonies. It was designed to reform offenders through a coercive system of labour. Convict situations would improve if they served enough time with good behaviour, but if they resisted the system, they were punished. William Douglas chose resistance. In his 9 years on the island, he was punished for 32 separate offences, ranging from misdemeanours like drunkenness and obscene language, to serious crimes like riotous behaviour and assault. Douglas remained a recidivist despite the fact he was sent almost the entire length of Van Diemen's Land, despite receiving punishments of 49 months and 14 days hard labour, both with and without chains, and despite suffering 8 bouts of solitary confinement, totaling 49 days and 12 hours in isolation. But in Van Diemen's Land, Douglas not only made a name for himself as a criminal, he was also a renowned prize fighter. Although prize fighting, or what we might call bare-knuckle boxing, was illegal in Van Diemen's Land at the time, these matches drew large crowds and its champions held a high degree of local fame. The moniker Black Douglas actually originated here, in the ring, as William Douglas's prize-fighting name. Douglas was not to stay in Van Diemen's Land forever. After serving his sentence, he was one of hundreds of ex-convicts who flocked to the colony of Victoria during the gold rush of the 1850s. This is the Douglas we first encountered in this talk, and the time when the noise about him in the colonial archive rang out the loudest. But the depiction of Douglas as a heinous gold rush criminal does not match the evidence, and was certainly not how Douglas saw himself. In 1853, Douglas was arrested for drunkenness, and at his hearing, he complained that the police were always pouncing on him and that he had a bad reputation without cause. Although in this instance he was eventually discharged, the mayor, then serving as magistrate, didn't let Douglas go without reminding him of the old English proverb, "Give a dog an ill name and hang him," signalling that Douglas's plight was hopeless as he'd lost his reputation. We need to push beyond the colonial fascination with Douglas as a gold rush villain, and even push beyond our own fixation with bushranging to see Douglas's life in its entirety. Other bushrangers like Douglas deserve to be seen on their own terms and their own worldviews and experiences brought back into the present. This means unpacking Douglas's relationship to the white male bushranging tradition, but also pushing beyond it to expand our frame of reference. we need to consider his experiences as a free African-American man in Philadelphia, his seafaring experience, his time as a labourer in the British coastal town of Rye, as well as his convict and carceral experiences and the space he carved for himself within them, if we're to bring back not only his humanity that was stripped from the records, but the messy brilliance of his life. This same urgency and these same stakes apply to all other bushrangers, those who weren't white men in my book. We need to shift the perspective from a colonial viewpoint and from our own back onto other bushrangers themselves. If we uncritically add William Douglas, Mary Ann Bugg, Sam Poo, or Jimmy Governor to the bushranging legend, then we risk erasing their own worldviews and co-opting them for our own ends. This would be particularly damaging, considering that each of these people was stripped of their personhood and used as some kind of vessel, myth, or symbol to serve colonist interests in their own times. We can't let history repeat itself. We shouldn't impose a settler framework onto other bushrangers' lives and flatten out the differences that defined their experience. In rushing to make them heroes, we can very easily erase what made them human. Our national bushranging heroes tell us something about who we are and what we believe in. But the other bushrangers, the ones we've excluded, perhaps tell us even more. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Meg. It's almost 1 a.m. where Meg is, but she has agreed to stay online. She has promised me she's completely caffeinated. So if you have any questions, please send them through in the chat and we'll get through as many of those as we can. We do have a few that have come in, and the first one is actually something that struck me as you were doing your slides today. I'd never seen Ned Kelly and his cohort described in terms of new and exquisite pictorial representations. I thought that was quite interesting. But the actual question is around the pictorial material, and did you find that useful? Because the visual literacy around bushrangers is quite well established. And did that help you fill some of the gaps as you were researching the more text-based archive?
The visual material was incredibly important, and also something that drew me to this research, I guess, to begin with, because I came to it first as, I guess, an Australian who's kind of through osmosis got that national tradition, seen those images, and the resonance of a Ned Kelly helmet is just so intense and so instant for most Australians. It's something that's incredibly powerful. In the book itself, I have quite a few images, both historical images and contemporary art. And I mean, they serve a range of purposes. So there are some that are illustrative of a broader point about bushranging. So there was one in my slides today where I had a bushranging hold up. So it's nice to kind of have a visual representation of that from the time. But there are others that problematize what bushranging is. There are others that push the boundaries further. So in my book in particular, I try to include contemporary art because there aren't a lot of visual representations, if any, of the bushrangers that I'm looking at. I've got one photograph of Mary Ann Bugg. I've got a couple of photographs of Jimmy Governor, but mainly mugshots, which are quite problematic sources in themselves. And so trying to actually get that artistic angle and be like, okay, well, how are contemporary and quite young artists as well, how are they engaging with these stories? How are they reimagining them? How are they playing with these visual tropes that we know so well? And so, yeah, the visual material was very important for a range of purposes in this work. Thank you.
Lots of people are saying thank you. Some are specifying thank you for being up in the middle of the night to present to us today. It's much appreciated. Somebody is reminding people, if you haven't heard of it, this is a great point. There is a podcast available. I should clarify, it is an award-winning podcast on Jimmy Governor and the Governor Men by Catherine Biber called Outlaws. And she's done a lot of work with descendants of the Governor family. So do have a look out for that if you're keen to find out more. We have someone else who is a descendant of a bushranger. Thanks so much, Meg and State Library. Gentleman Dick is a forebear of mine, never caught, the New England tablelands, and he was harboured by the Joey nuns. So not only do you have a bushranger, but you actually have one that got away with it, which I think is quite impressive. But back to the archival sources that you've spoken about so much today, we have a really interesting question around locating the bushrangers' own views and if they speak at all in the archives.
Yeah, so it's very varied. So someone like Black Douglas, William Douglas, I've got a couple of instances where his words are mediated through other people. So that final quote, for example, where he says that he's being pounced on by the police without cause, that's secondhand evidence. But we do get a sense of who he is as a person and the kind of sense of injustice that he feels. Then you have someone like Jimmy Governor, and the table turns again because he's incredibly vocal. We have not only his own words from, he was discussing his crimes with reporters once he was caught, but even beforehand, he actually left letters to the police, a la Ned Kelly, like writing about his grievances, saying he was a bushranger, wanting these letters to be printed in the newspaper as well. And so we've really got a breadth of different source material and a breadth of experience there. I should also say that a lot of these bushrangers are quite savvy when it comes to the politics of representation and what is going to best serve their interests. So the case of Mary Bugg, for instance, she is an incredible Aboriginal woman who did whatever she could to survive on the run. Sometimes that meant berating the police verbally, sometimes it meant physically getting into altercations with them. And when she's before the court, she presents herself as a very demure, respectable lady who says she's, just following her husband. And if she's received stolen goods, then, well, what is a poor wife to do? And so there's also an element of that as well. So seeing where these bushrangers are quite savvy, they're aware of when their public persona needs to be kept and when it can slide. And that is also a really incredible part of the story.
Thank goodness none of them were on Twitter. We have another question, is kind of leading off from your discussion about pictures and using that sort of visual material to help you with your research. Somebody's asking that in addition to going to libraries and archives, did you go to the places where these bushrangers were operating, and did the actual sites of some of the towns where they committed these crimes, was that of any use to you while you were working on this project?
Yeah, I did. I went on a big road trip as part of the research. And it was pretty incredible because obviously when you're reading material, you're kind of imaginatively reconstructing certain physical characteristics. But then when you're in a place, that history just comes to life and you got a perspective that you just wouldn't have, and like little details and insights that just make the story so much more rich and compelling. So for example, driving part of the area that Jimmy Governor was on the run in, I could literally see that the soil was changing color from, reds to browns to like chalky golds. And that adds a whole other element. So I can then say that, those colors of soil would have coated his dusty boots while he was on the run. But on another instance, like a sense of distance and a sense of the kind of harshness of different types of country was also really, really telling. I look at one point of my the chapters of Jimmy Governor, not just about Governor himself, but his Aboriginal family, and they were actually illegally imprisoned. The men and of the group of Aboriginal people his family were a part of were taken away and chained to each other and forced to walk from Walla to Mudgee. And I actually drove from Walla to Mudgee, and knowing what that distance is like, seeing how harsh that country is, thinking of what that time of year would have been like, this is also in winter, just adds an extra layer of that kind of that lived texture of that experience and brings history to life in a way that I think really pairs beautifully with those written sources.
And it's so important for crime histories too. And sometimes you get a little bit frustrated with them though, because it's like, why did you go that way? You should have gone that way. But anyway, we're not here to advise them. We're just here to tell their stories. Somebody is asking about your introduction in today's talk and this idea of widespread support for bushrangers. They're asking how widespread you believe that was, particularly in the middle of the 1800s and sort of going into the 1860s.
I mean, it's actually quite a difficult question to answer because as the material I mentioned in my talk, how much is very enthusiastic support where, you know, supporters are ideologically aligned with the mission of certain bushrangers, or where they're, you know, there are kinship bonds and family, versus when it's a very strategic and practical way of surviving in, you know, quite unsettled, dispersed territory at that time. It's quite difficult to know. Obviously, folklore is a really interesting source for trying to situate that a little bit more. So when you have ballads and songs and stories passed around campfires that originate from the times these bushrangers operated in, that gives some indication that there was a popular interest in these people, but also comparing the folkloric representation to the facts of these bushrangers' experiences is obviously quite important, and they don't always gel, they don't always align. And so sometimes it's more people creating the heroes they need rather than these real people being able to fulfill all of those roles. So it's not a very satisfying answer to your question. I wish I knew more, but the material is really murky, and I guess that murkiness is itself quite interesting.
And this is quite a good question that's going back to your practice as a researcher. So a lot of pressure to say you're going to say something quite new about a slice of history that is fairly well trod. Lots and lots of people have written about bushrangers. And having set yourself this task to look at these hidden histories and to reveal more stories about these men and women, were you anxious along the way when the archive was not as generous as it could have been? Did you ever think that it's actually too hard to tell this story in a completely new way?
That's an excellent question. If you're asking whether I had crises along the research journey as to whether I could actually pull this off.
Odd moment.
Yes. I think it's mainly about getting creative. So I was mentored really strongly by Grace Karskens, which some brilliant historian, some of you probably know. And she used to say that I could find a source and kind of get blood from the stone. So one little detail, I found that I could blow it out, and I could use that detail to help situate an individual in the world they lived in, the social world, the interactions they would have had, the opportunities open to them, and the barriers barring their way. So when I wasn't able to say exactly what was happening in someone's life, but I knew about where they were, about what was happening to people like them at that time, I was able to kind of plug some of those gaps. But I am quite upfront in the book when I'm making those types of leaps, and I'm quite upfront when there is a paucity of information. But I think it's important to try still, otherwise we're still stuck with those colonial biases, and these people remain erased. So although it's imperfect, I think that it's still very important to give it a red hot go, and I hope I've done that in the book.
And this is always a terrible question for somebody with a book that's quite new. Yours only came out in November, and I've lost lighting here, so it's almost time for us to go. But what next? And would you be guided for your next project by somebody who had, for example, 160 archive boxes sitting there beautifully catalogued that was sort of easier to plunder than these bushrangers?
No, I'm addicted now to the new stories, the hidden stories, the ones where yeah, I already have, I mean, spoiler alert, I have several bushrangers I would like to look at, especially looking at people who were highway women in the UK who then came to Australia, and whether they did pick up bushranging. There are 2 South Asian men as well, one from India, one from Sri Lanka, who are engaged in bushranging crime in the early 1800s. The main thing is whether this research can be funded. So that's the thing, the type of slow history, the type of work that I do requires basically belief on the part of any type of funding body, whether that be exactly to join those dots, to go on that detective hunt essentially, and to kind of pursue every available lead. But those are the stories that I think are important. Those are the ones that I think that we need to be diverting research to, the hidden stories, the ones that were erased. And I hope that I have the resources in the future to pursue that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That is all we have time for today. Please come back next time. Dr. Molly Duggins, who is the library's 2021 Merriweather Fellow, will be giving a very lively presentation about Major James Wallace's memorial album of the colony of New South Wales. And she'll be explaining that album as a two-dimensional counterpart to one of our most famous objects here in the library's collection, the Macquarie Collector's Chest. So if you love all that sort of stuff from our colonial past and how people collected and tried to understand this strange place called New South Wales that they found themselves in, then do come back. That's Tuesday, the 7th of March at 11 a.m. and bookings for that talk are open now. Until then, stay safe, and I hope to see you on site or online soon. Bye-bye, everyone.